The text came through at 2:00 a.m., while rain tapped softly against my hotel window in Seattle. Dad. Said, "We're selling your house while you're away. You're welcome." For a few seconds, I just stared at the glow of the screen, half asleep, half numb, trying to convince myself it was some cruel joke. But my father's arrogance never needed sleep, and I should have known better. The house he sold wasn't just walls and bricks. It was the only thing I'd ever built on my own, the only proof that I could stand without him. And worst, it wasn't just my home anymore. It was a $4.6 million federal safe house under witness protection. And with one careless sale, he hadn't just betrayed me. He'd put innocent lives in danger. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. I typed back, before I could think. "What do you mean, Dad? What house?" The dots appeared almost instantly. He was awake. "The one in Arlington? You're never there anyway. We sold it, got $1.1 million cash, finally put that money to good use, helping your sister with her wedding. You're welcome." My throat went dry. For a long moment, I just stared at the message, unable to form a thought that made sense. Arlington, my house, the one I bought 5 years ago after my first big promotion, the one I'd chosen specifically because of its security layout, its distance from the courthouse, its reinforced basement, the one the U.S. Marshals Service had quietly converted into a federal safe house under my authorization. I whispered to the empty room. He sold a federal property. I swung my legs off the bed, the carpet cold under my feet. My hands were shaking as I tried calling him once, twice, 3 times. Straight to voicemail. I could picture him asleep in that big old house in Richmond, confident he'd just done something generous, something fatherly. He had no idea what he'd actually done. Or maybe he did. I opened my laptop and logged into the real estate portal tied to the agency. My password felt foreign under my fingers. The connection lagged the hotel Wi-Fi crawling. Then it appeared. My property ID number flagged as transferred. The sale had closed 2 days ago. For a moment, all I could do was stare at the confirmation. My name was still listed under previous owner. The new name, Bayfront Holdings, LLC, glowed in black and white. My pulse climbed higher. I took a screenshot, emailed it to my work account, and sat back in the chair trying to breathe through the shock pressing into my chest. Rain hammered harder against the window. I could feel the thin wall of the hotel room vibrating with the storm outside. I tried calling Mom next, knowing she'd be awake, worrying about something as small as a thunderstorm, but her phone went unanswered too. I stood pacing. The air felt too thick to breathe. Every thought crashed into the next. What about the tenants? The security system? The witness list? Who had access to the files? Did anyone on the team know the sale happened? How long before the protection detail found out they'd just been living inside a house that no longer belonged to the government? I thought about Elena Moretti, the woman hiding there with her 2 kids, the kids' drawings taped to the fridge, the security guard who checked in twice a day. If the wrong person now owned that property. I didn't finish the thought. I grabbed my phone again, scrolled to the contact list, and hovered over Crawford's name. Deputy Chief Alan Crawford didn't appreciate middle-of-the-night calls, not unless someone's life depended on it. This time it did. I hesitated only a second before pressing the call button. It rang once, twice. A rough voice came through, groggy. "Mitchell." "Wait. Hayes. This better be worth waking me up for." "Sir, we have a problem," I said, forcing my voice steady even as adrenaline burned through my hands. "What kind of problem? My father sold my house in Arlington." There was silence on the other end. "Then, your house, the one the service uses." "Yes, sir. He sold it without my consent. Cash sale." Another pause, heavier this time. I could hear him exhale. "Jesus Christ, Lauren, that's a federal safe house." "I know." "When did it close?" "According to the record, 2 days ago." I could hear papers rustling on his desk even though it was the middle of the night in D.C. We'll confirm ownership first thing in the morning. Get the Moretti family out of there immediately. I'll be on the first flight back. He hesitated before hanging up. Hayes, don't do anything else until we talk in person. Not one call. Not to your family. Understood. Yes, sir. The line went dead. I sank onto the bed again, still gripping the phone. Outside, the storm broke fully wind, rattling the windows like something was trying to get in. My reflection in the glass looked like a stranger, wide-eyed pale, the loose strands of hair sticking to my face. He sold it. He actually sold it. I opened my email, typed a quick message to Crawford summarizing the details, attached the screenshot, and hit send. My hands wouldn't stop trembling. I sat there for a long time, listening to the hum of the air conditioner and the relentless tapping of rain against glass. I tried to picture my father's face, the calm certainty in his voice when he thought he was doing something right. He had no idea what kind of storm he'd unleashed. Finally, I picked up the phone again, thumb hovering over Crawford's number, and whispered to myself, "Sir, we have a serious problem." Then I pressed call. Hayes, Crawford's voice rasped through the line, heavy with sleep and irritation. I could almost picture him rubbing his face, the desk lamp in his office still on because he never really went home before midnight. "It's gone, sir," I said. "My father sold it. The house in Arlington. The sale closed 2 days ago." There was a pause, then a sound like a chair creaking. "The Arlington property," he repeated slowly, the realization catching up to him. "That's a federal safe house." Jesus Christ, Hayes. "Yes, sir." "How the hell?" "Never mind. Book the first flight back to DRC. I'll have the relocation team ready before you land. Nobody breathes a word of this until I say so." The call ended before I could reply. I sat there a moment longer, listening to the silence pressing in from every direction, the rain still pounding the windows. It was 2:40 a.m., and my body was buzzing like I'd swallowed electricity. I packed on autopilot, laptop files, badge weapon. When I zipped the bag shut, the sound echoed sharp in the quiet room. I didn't even bother changing. I just threw on a coat and left. At the airport, the terminal was almost empty. Red-eye travelers slumped in plastic chairs under the cold fluorescent lights. I ordered a coffee I didn't drink and stared at the boarding gate as if staring long enough might somehow make the world reset itself. By the time the plane lifted off, dawn was barely touching the horizon. I sat by the window watching the blackness fade into a smear of violet and gold. The hum of the engines filled the silence between thoughts I didn't want to have. Every detail of the Arlington house ran through my mind. The reinforced doors, the double locks, the coded entry, the panic room in the basement I'd helped design. I remembered the meeting where I'd volunteered the property for the service's use, proud that it met every federal standard for witness protection. And now, because my father thought he was being helpful, or because he needed money, the entire system could be compromised. I pressed my forehead to the window. Below me, the country stretched endlessly east, the faint glow of cities flickering through the clouds. The motion, the distance, the helplessness of it all triggered a memory I hadn't thought of in years. It was spring of 2018. I was standing on that same front porch in Arlington, a ring of new keys in my hand. The realtor had just left the sold sign still planted in the grass. I'd taken a deep breath and told myself, "This is yours. You did this." Later that night, my father had called. "You bought a house," he'd said, half amused, half annoyed. Without telling me I didn't need to, I'd said, "I paid for it myself." "That's the problem," he'd snapped. "You think independence means shutting everyone out. You don't let anyone help you. I don't need help, Dad." He'd gone quiet for a moment, then said, "You will. Sooner or later." I remembered ending that call and standing in the dark kitchen feeling both angry and oddly sad. He'd never congratulated me. Not once. Now, sitting on the plane years later, I realized how deeply that silence had cut. A flight attendant passed by offering water. I shook my head. My stomach felt tight, heavy. The plane rattled in turbulence, but the sound barely reached me. What haunted me most wasn't the loss of the property or the money. It was knowing what that house represented. To me, to the service, to the people counting on us to keep them alive. Elena Moretti and her 2 kids had been moved there 3 weeks ago after their last safe house was compromised. A mother and her children hiding from a man powerful enough to make people disappear. If the sale gave anyone access to that address, even by accident, they were in danger. I tried calling the night supervisor for the protection unit, but the line went straight to voicemail. I left a short message. "This is Deputy Hayes. Verify current occupancy status on property 9A Arlington immediately. Relocation order pending." The pilot announced turbulence, but I hardly noticed. I watched the sky brighten into morning, each layer of color sharp as a blade. When the plane began to descend into D.C., I could see the Potomac glittering below sunlight breaking over the river. I'd flown that route 100 times, but never like this, never with my life tilting out of balance. As we landed, my phone buzzed again. A message from Crawford team en route to Arlington. "Will confirm occupancy. Get to HQ as soon as you land." I texted back. "On my way." Walking through the terminal, the weight of my badge felt different. Heavier somehow. I moved fast through the crowd, the early commuters and families in line for coffee, everyone absorbed in their own small worlds. Outside, the chill of Virginia spring cut through my jacket. The cab smelled of old leather and coffee, and the driver hummed softly to the radio. I sat in the back watching the skyline come into view, the city slowly waking under pale light. Every instinct in me screamed to head straight to the house, but Crawford's words replayed in my head. "Don't do anything until we talk in person." I clenched my jaw, forcing patience. I'd followed every rule my entire career, and look where it had gotten me. Betrayed by my own family. The car merged onto the freeway traffic beginning to build. I stared out at the passing exits, the names of neighborhoods blurring together. Somewhere out there, my father was probably eating breakfast, proud of himself for fixing my life again. The thought made my chest tighten. He'd always believed he knew better, that I'd never truly grown up. He didn't see me as an agent, a professional, an adult. Just his stubborn daughter who wouldn't let him in. Well, now he'd forced his way in. As the cab pulled off toward Arlington, the sun climbed higher, washing the city in gold. I caught my reflection in the window. Calm on the surface, but every muscle coiled tight. By the time we reached headquarters, my decision was already made. Whatever it took, I was going to fix this. Because if I didn't, people could die. And for the first time in years, I didn't just feel like a daughter cleaning up her father's mess. I felt like an officer walking into a disaster zone of her own bloodline. The conference room smelled like burnt coffee and panic. Sunlight barely touched the blinds, and every face around the table looked a shade too pale for the hour. Crawford stood at the head, his tie crooked, his sleeves rolled to the elbows, signs of a man who hadn't gone home yet. Patricia Owens was already connected to the projector, her laptop screen flashing lines of legal text and property data. The sale went through Bayfront Holdings LLC, she said, scrolling through the record. Filed 2 days ago through a title company in Delaware. Cash transaction. $1.1 million. Crawford's jaw tightened. That house was appraised at 4.6. 75% under market, Patricia added. No mortgage, no escrow, hold no standard inspection paperwork. It's what we'd call a ghost sale. My stomach nodded. That's exactly what it sounds like, I said quietly. A setup. Crawford turned to me. Your father initiated the transfer. I nodded. The account matches his name. He had power of attorney years ago when I was deployed. I never revoked it. He muttered something under his breath. Well, revoke it now. Then louder, Owens, start tracing Bayfront Holdings. I want every name on that chain by the end of the day. Hayes, get your vest. We're pulling the Moretti family out of there now. I can handle the relocation, sir. You'll handle it, he said, but you won't go in armed. You're too close to this. Rodriguez and Chin will take point. You're back up. Understood. I nodded, though every muscle in my body wanted to argue. Within 20 minutes, we were in 2 SUVs heading toward Arlington. The sky was washed out gray, the air heavy with that early spring dampness that sticks to everything. My stomach twisted tighter with every mile. Rodriguez drove knuckles white on the wheel. "You think your dad knew?" he asked quietly. I stared out the window. If he didn't, he should have. He was in real estate his entire life. "Hell of a thing," Chin murmured from the back. "Family doing this to you." I didn't answer. The closer we got, the less I trusted my own voice. When the house came into view, my breath caught. It looked exactly the same. White siding, trimmed hedges, the blue shutters I'd chosen myself. But knowing what I knew now, it felt foreign, violated. Rodriguez parked half a block away. We approached on foot, pretending to be a maintenance team so we wouldn't alarm the neighbors. My badge felt heavy against my hip. I knocked twice firm but controlled. Elena Moretti opened the door halfway. She was still in pajamas, hair pulled back, eyes wide with confusion. "Deputy Hayes," she whispered. "What's going on?" I kept my tone calm. "We need to relocate you immediately. Pack only essentials. Documents, medications, anything for the kids. We're on a time clock." Her expression shifted from confusion to fear. "Did they find us?" "Not yet," I said. "But we can't take that chance." Behind her, two small faces appeared at the top of the stairs. Her children, a boy, maybe 6, a girl around 8. They stared at the strangers in black vests and the SUVs outside. I stepped inside, scanning the layout automatically. The rooms were as I'd left them. Neutral colors, tidy safe. The hidden cameras were still running the panic button near the pantry, blinking a steady green. Everything about the house screamed control order safety, until now. Rodriguez moved to the back door to secure the perimeter. Chin gathered the kids' backpacks, moving quickly, but gently. Elena hesitated by the kitchen counter, staring at the framed photo of her family from before witness protection. "You told me this place was untouchable," she said softly. I met her eyes. It was until someone touched it. She didn't ask who. Maybe she saw something in my face that told her enough. 15 minutes later, the house was stripped of any personal items. The team loaded the family into the back of the first SUV. Elena sat, clutching her kids, her hands shaking despite the heater running full blast. Crawford's voice came through the radio. "Hayes status." "All clear," I said. "Family secure. We're en route to Site B. Copy that. Do not return to the property. Leave it sealed." As we pulled away, I turned in my seat for one last look. The house glowed faintly in the morning light, as peaceful and ordinary as any suburban home. The mailbox still had my name etched into the brass plate, L. Hayes. I thought about the nights I'd spent patching drywall, repainting, making the place mine. I thought about the quiet evenings when I'd believed I'd finally built something untouchable, something no one could take. And then I thought of my father signing papers somewhere in Richmond, probably smiling while he did it. Rodriguez switched on the siren for the escort unit ahead. The red and blue lights flared in the rearview mirror, flashing across my face. I watched them fade and return, a pulsing reminder of everything unraveling behind us. No one spoke for the rest of the ride. The road stretched ahead, empty and gray. I kept my eyes on the mirror until the house disappeared from view, swallowed by the trees. Only then did I let myself breathe. I told myself it was just a property, just another assignment gone bad. But deep down I knew that was a lie. That house had been my proof that I could build something solid out of my own effort. Now it was evidence in a federal crime, and the fingerprints on the paperwork belonged to my father. As the convoy turned onto the highway, I leaned back against the seat and closed my eyes. The hum of the engine drowned out the storm inside my head. For the first time in my career, I didn't know which was worse. The betrayal itself, or the fact that I still wanted to believe he hadn't meant it. By the time I got back to headquarters, the adrenaline had burned off, leaving nothing but exhaustion and a dull ache behind my eyes. The command floor buzzed with low voices and the hum of printers. Patricia Owens was already waiting in the operations room. Sleeves rolled up her laptop, open and glowing in the dim light. She gestured for me to sit. I've been digging through the corporate registry, she said. Bayfront Holdings, LLC. Delaware address, of course. Shell company. Registered under a proxy agent who's represented half a dozen suspicious entities in the last 3 years. I leaned forward, scanning the screen. Who signed the purchase documents? She clicked once, zooming in on a scanned signature. Grace Palmer. Recognized the name. It took me a second. Then it hit. She's a real estate broker, used to work the Richmond area. My dad used her for a few deals before his business collapsed. Patricia nodded grimly. She's been involved in several quick cash sales over the past year. Luxury properties moving well below market value. Every single one tied to either offshore accounts or high-risk buyers hiding behind limited partnerships. I'd call that a pattern. Crawford walked in, coffee in one hand, the other already pointing at the screen. Pattern or conspiracy? Could be both, Patricia said. The LLC's lawyer is the same one used by a known Costello associate in a 2022 laundering case. No direct line yet, but the breadcrumbs are there. The room felt suddenly smaller. I folded my arms. So, Grace Palmer sold my father a story about easy money and he bought it. Patricia hesitated. Or he was the one who offered her the deal. Crawford shot me a glance. You think your old man could have been approached directly by the Costello organization? I wanted to say no. I wanted to say he was too proud, too stupidly self-righteous for that kind of risk. Instead, I said, he knows how to spot a scam. If he went through with this, it wasn't blind. Crawford rubbed the bridge of his nose. Christ, we might be looking at an intentional leak. If Bayfront Holdings is a Costello front, that house wasn't bought. It was targeted. My chest tightened. Targeted for what? A witness. A file. Patricia flipped to another page. The house's location fits the pattern of safe properties used by the Witness Security Program in the Mid-Atlantic region. They could be testing the system, buying one address at a time to find the rest. The words hit me harder than I expected. My throat felt dry. You're saying someone used my family to crack a federal protection grid? Possibly, Patricia said quietly, and they might not even realize how deep they're in. I laughed once, bitter. Oh, he realizes. My father always realizes. He just thinks he's smarter than everyone else. Crawford sighed, setting the coffee down. We'll need financial records. Bank statements, phone logs, everything. And subpoena what you can through the Delaware court. Hayes. I'll need you to sit down with Internal Affairs. They're going to ask if you had any prior contact with the buyers. I didn't. I know, but they'll still ask. The meeting dissolved into quiet activity. Patricia typed rapidly, pulling up linked entities. Bayfront Holdings, Harborline Investments, Meridian Financial Group, each a hollow name leading to the same post office box in Wilmington. I watched the screen blur. Behind the hum of the computers, I could hear the steady tick of the wall clock. Every sound in the room seemed amplified, the kind of silence that makes guilt echo. Finally, Patricia looked up. Lauren. Her tone had softened. This wasn't your fault. I met her eyes. Tell that to the Moretti kid sleeping in a relocation van tonight. She didn't answer. Later that afternoon, I went down to records to pull the archived contracts from my father's business. The clerk, a gray-haired woman who'd known me since my first year in the service, gave me a sympathetic look but said nothing. I flipped through folders filled with old deeds, closing statements and signatures that all felt like ghosts. And there it was. Grace Palmer's name scribbled in neat professional loops beside my father's on a deal dated 2 years earlier. A consultation fee for $50,000 marked as expedited service. My stomach turned. When I returned upstairs, Crawford and Patricia were in his office. The air smelled like stale coffee and tension. Crawford motioned me in. Patricia clicked a few keys and turned the laptop toward me. We found something else. Take a look. On the screen was a photo. Sunlight, grass, smiling faces. A charity golf event banner fluttering behind them. My father in his favorite navy polo, one arm slung casually around a blonde woman in sunglasses. Grace Palmer. For a moment, I couldn't speak. my mind filled with every rationalization I'd rehearsed since this started, every way to make this less awful than it was. But there it was. Proof, Patricia said gently. Taken last month. Richmond Golf Club. She listed him as a business partner on her LinkedIn profile. I stared at the screen, the image blurring as my vision went sharp around the edges. Business partner, I repeated. Crawford's voice was quiet. Hayes, this isn't going away. Whatever this is, it's deeper than a family mistake. I nodded slowly, forcing air into my lungs. Then let's dig. He gave a curt nod. We already are. When I left the office, I walked straight past my desk, past the elevators, and out into the courtyard behind the building. The sky had turned overcast again, thick clouds swallowing the afternoon sun. I leaned against the railing, phone in hand, staring at the photo one more time. For years, I'd built my life around the idea that my father's arrogance was harmless, annoying, frustrating, but never dangerous. And now his pride had opened a door that could get people killed. The wind picked up, carrying the faint sound of traffic from the highway. I deleted the photo from my phone, but knew the image was burned into my mind. Grace Palmer, my father, the same smile, the same confidence. For the first time, I wondered if he'd always been this person, and I'd just been too blind to see it. The photograph still burned in my mind long after I'd left the building, but what haunted me even more was how unsurprised I was. The next day, Patricia's report confirmed what we already suspected. My father had initiated the transaction. The bank records listed his personal account as the origin for the wire transfer, and the signature on the sale authorization was his, written in the same sharp pen strokes I'd grown up watching him use to sign Christmas cards and reprimands. It forced me back to a memory I hadn't visited in years. 2015. Richmond. I was standing in the doorway of my father's office, 26 years old, just home from my first federal assignment. His empire, Hayes Realty Group, was collapsing around him. The phones had stopped ringing, the framed awards on the wall had started to collect dust, and stacks of unpaid invoices buried his desk. He sat behind it, eyes sunken, tie loose, the once perfect man who'd taught me never to show weakness. On the desk lay the morning paper. The headline read, Richard Hayes's Firm Collapses After Fraud Investigation. He snatched it up and hurled it across the room. They love this, he said, voice shaking. One mistake and they treat you like a criminal. Dad. I started carefully. You can recover from this. Just recover. He laughed bitterly. There's no recovering from humiliation, Lauren. Once they've decided you're finished, that's it. I watched him crumble in slow motion over the next few months. Friends stopped calling, creditors hounded him, and the house grew quiet except for the TV running endless business news. The fall of Richard Hayes wasn't just financial. It was personal, almost biblical. That memory had faded over time, but now it returned vivid and sharp. It was the seed of everything that came after. In the present, he was sitting in the same study when my mother Margaret confronted him. I could imagine the scene clearly. Curtains drawn, whiskey glass, half-empty documents spread across the table like trophies. Richard, are you sure you want to do this? She asked, her voice thin, anxious. It's Lauren's house. She'll never forgive you. He didn't even look up. That house exists because of me. Because she carries my name. She wouldn't have half the opportunities she has without the reputation I built. Margaret hesitated. That reputation doesn't exist anymore. He turned sharply, eyes narrowing. Then I'll rebuild it. You think the people who laughed when I went bankrupt won't see this as a comeback? A smart business move. A clean cash deal in a high-end market. This will remind them who I am, Richard, she said softly. It's her home. It's a property, and properties are meant to move. My phone rang that evening. When I saw his name, I almost ignored it. But something inside me, some misplaced sense of duty, made me answer. Lauren, he said, tone casual, almost cheerful. I assume you've heard. I have. My voice was cold. You sold my house. he exhaled. I streamlined an asset you weren't using. Don't dramatize this. It's not dramatizing when you sell a federal safe house. Federal safe house. He let out a low chuckle. Come on, don't start with your agency lingo. You think I don't know what a real estate designation looks like? You bought that place under your name, not the government's. It was your personal property, and I had legal access. You left that door open. I could hear papers rustling on his end, maybe the contract itself. You're welcome, by the way, he added. I got you a fair price. Fair, I said, trying not to shout. $1.1 million on a property worth $4.5. You handed it away for pennies. He sighed. You've always had a terrible sense of money. You see value in things that don't matter. The market's soft. I moved fast. I got results. Results. I could hear my pulse in my ears. You sold a location tied to an active protection case. Do you even understand what you've done? He paused long enough for me to know he'd heard the words. Then laughed again, low and condescending. Don't lecture me about laws, Lauren. I was negotiating real estate before you could drive a car. You think because you wear a badge you're smarter than everyone else? This isn't about being smart, I said. It's about the lives you just put in danger. Lives, he repeated, mocking. Always the hero, huh? You think the government cares about you, about those people you move from one safe house to another? You're a pawn, Lauren. You protect ghosts. I build something real, by stealing from your daughter, by reclaiming what's mine. The line went silent for a moment. Then he said almost softly, You'll thank me someday when you realize family matters more than your damn badge. I hung up before I said something I couldn't take back. Afterward, I sat in my car outside headquarters, phone still in my hand. My fingers were numb, gripping it so hard they ached. The sound of his voice lingered, the arrogance, the certainty that he could twist anything into virtue. A parking light flickered overhead, buzzing faintly. Across the lot, the flag outside the building hung limp in the still air. I stared at it, feeling hollowed out. He'd always taught me that everything had value. Property, people, reputation. But he never understood that value isn't measured in money. It's measured in trust. And he'd just sold both. As I sat there, I could still hear his parting words echoing in my head, smug and certain I'll show you who really understands what something's worth. The anger came in waves, not loud, but cold, quiet, precise. I knew then this wasn't ignorance or desperation. It was pride. The same pride that had destroyed him before, and now was going to destroy everything else in his path. I started the car, gripping the wheel until my knuckles went white. I didn't know yet how to stop him, but for the first time in my life, I knew I'd have to. The next morning started with a pounding headache and a stack of files waiting on my desk. The office smelled like burnt coffee and tension. Crawford had called in the FBI overnight, and by 8 a.m., 2 agents were already set up in our operations room. One of them, Special Agent Ryan McCall, introduced himself with a firm handshake and a sympathetic half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. I've been briefed, he said. Let's start with the bank trail. We sat shoulder to shoulder in front of a monitor filled with spreadsheets. Columns of transactions, dates, routing numbers, highlighted amounts that made my stomach twist. Ryan pointed at a line in the middle of the screen. $200,000 wire transfer from Richard Hayes to a Grace Palmer, labeled as consulting fee. I leaned closer. That's not consulting. That's laundering. He nodded. Consulting fees that large are the favorite disguise. Move money, create fake invoices, wash the cash through shell companies, and voila. Clean money. Whoever he's dealing with, they're not amateurs. I stared at the screen, fighting the instinct to defend the man I used to call my father. He wouldn't even know how to structure something like that, I said quietly. Ryan gave me a look that was neither cruel nor gentle, just factual. Someone taught him. He started mapping the connections, his hands moving fast across the keyboard. Arrows appeared on the digital whiteboard, each one linking accounts like veins in a growing disease. Here he said, tapping one endpoint. Funds move from Hayes' account to Grace Palmer, then to an offshore entity called Northline Trade, then bounce again to Bayfront Holdings, LLC, and from there straight into a numbered account flagged by FinCEN last year. The name at the end of the chain froze me. Vincent Costello Jr., Ryan said, reading it aloud. Son of the late Vincent Costello Sr., head of the Mid-Atlantic Syndicate. Junior's been running the operation since his father went away for life, and recently he's been expanding, buying up property through proxies. I exhaled slowly. He bought my house. Ryan nodded grimly. And if he did, we have a much bigger problem than a bad sale. He's been trying to identify our safe house network for months. This could be the crack he needed. The words hit me harder than any accusation. My house wasn't just compromised, it was a doorway. Crawford stormed into the room 10 minutes later, his tie crooked, his face gray with exhaustion. Brief me, he demanded. Ryan summarized the chain, pointing to the final connection. Crawford listened, jaw tightening with every word. When Ryan finished, the deputy chief turned to me. You're off this investigation. What you're personally connected to the primary suspect. You know that's a conflict of interest. Internal Affairs will have my badge if I let you near this. With respect, sir, I'm the only one who knows how that house was structured, who had access to it, how the protection files were stored. I know he cut in, but you're also the daughter of the man who sold it. That's not something we can explain to a federal judge. I swallowed hard. If I step back now, you'll waste days bringing someone else up to speed. We don't have days. If Costello Jr. gets even one more address, the whole system collapses. Crawford looked at me for a long moment. His eyes softened slightly. Hayes, you're walking a razor here. You move 1 inch wrong and it won't just be your career. It'll be federal obstruction. I'll take that risk. He sighed, rubbed his temples, and muttered, You sound just like me 30 years ago. Then, after a pause, Fine. You can assist, but only under my supervision. You report everything through me. No exceptions. Yes, sir. But there was one exception I didn't say out loud. That night, when the office had gone quiet, I logged into the secure drive from my workstation. My hand trembled slightly as I typed in my personal clearance code. The screen loaded with my father's financial statements. Documents I wasn't supposed to have without a warrant. I copied the relevant files into an encrypted folder and sent them to Patricia Owens with a short message. For verification. Keep it between us. It was a violation of protocol, a federal offense if someone wanted to make it one. But the image of Elena Moretti's terrified eyes still haunted me. I couldn't let another family fall because I'd followed a rule written by someone who'd never been in the field. An hour later, my phone buzzed. Patricia's voice came through low and steady. You need to see this. I met her in the evidence review room. She slid a printed email across the table, the header already circled in red. It was from my father's personal address to Grace Palmer. The timestamp was a week before the sale. The subject line read, Confidential. Fast closure needed. The body of the email was short, almost clinical. Grace, make sure no one from the government sees the paperwork. I just need the money wired before the media sniffs out my debts. Keep it quiet and we both win. I read it twice. Then a third time. My throat felt like sandpaper. He knew I whispered. He knew exactly what he was doing. Patricia's voice was gentle but firm. Lauren, this email alone proves intent. He wasn't manipulated. He orchestrated it. I nodded slowly, though the word father had already stopped meaning what it used to. When she left me alone, I stood in the empty room staring at the single sheet of paper under the harsh fluorescent light. The words blurred at the edges as my vision went watery. I pressed my palms flat on the table, forcing myself to breathe. For years I'd believed his pride would only hurt himself. Now it had reached across states, across laws, and dragged me down with him. I folded the page carefully and slipped it into an evidence sleeve. My hands were shaking as I sealed it, knowing it would become part of the record that would end him. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the anger and betrayal, a smaller voice whispered that I'd just crossed a line too. But there was no other choice. Outside, the city lights bled through the office windows, cold and silent. I stood there for a long time, the email still echoing in my head, realizing that my father hadn't just fallen from grace. He'd jumped. dragging the rest of us straight into the dark after him. The gravel crunched under the tires as we turned off the main road onto the long drive that led to my family's farm outside Charlottesville. The fields stretched for acres on either side, bright and green under the afternoon sun. From a distance, it looked like a picture-perfect weekend. Balloons tied to the fence posts, kids running near the barn, music spilling from a set of speakers on the porch. The smell of grilled steak drifted through the air. It was supposed to be a reunion, a celebration of family. Instead, it was about to become an arrest scene. I parked behind Crawford's SUV at the edge of the property. He stepped out first, scanning the yard with the wary calm of someone who'd broken bad news too many times. Patricia followed, clutching a manila folder. The warrant. While 2 field agents from the regional task force flanked us. My pulse pounded as we walked toward the house. "Keep this quiet as long as you can," Crawford murmured. "Once he sees the badges, it's going to go south fast." I nodded, though my jaw was tight. The closer we got, the more I could hear the laughter, the clinking of glasses, my father's voice. Strong, confident, alive. Margaret stood near the patio table, fussing over a tray of food. Chloe, in a pale blue dress, was laughing with her fiancé Daniel, her hand resting casually on his arm. And there he was, Richard Hayes, standing in the center of it all, a glass of whiskey in hand, telling a story to a circle of relatives who hung on every word. For a brief second, I saw the man I remembered, charming, magnetic, completely in control of the world around him. Then he saw me. His smile faltered as he took in the scene. The government vehicles, the badges at our belts, the grim expressions. The yard fell silent, like someone had cut the music mid-song. "What's this?" he asked, voice loud, forced, jovial. "Is this supposed to be funny?" I stopped a few feet away. "We need to talk. Privately." He waved his hand dismissive. "We're family, nothing to hide." "Go ahead." Crawford's voice was even. "Mr. Hayes, this isn't a request." Richard ignored him and looked at me instead. "Lauren, what's going on?" I took a deep breath. "You sold federal property." He laughed once, sharp and incredulous. "Federal property. It was your house. It was designated as a federal safe house 18 months ago," I said. "We've been using it to shelter witnesses in active cases, including one tied to the Costello syndicate." The laughter died completely. I could hear the hum of the generator powering the string lights overhead. Margaret's hand went to her mouth. "Oh, Richard," she whispered. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Chloe looked between us, confused. "Wait, what are you saying?" Crawford stepped forward, pulling a document from his jacket. Under Title 18 U.S., Code Section 641, unauthorized sale of government property, constitutes a federal offense. We have a warrant for Mr. Hayes' arrest. My father blinked, the color draining from his face before he recovered it with practiced arrogance. "You can't be serious. I didn't know anything about that designation. Nobody told me the government was using it." Patricia's voice was calm, but razor sharp. "You were informed by email, Mr. Hayes. We have the message on record. Your acknowledgement of the property's restricted status." He turned to her, voice rising. "You don't understand how these deals work. It's just paperwork. I didn't intend any harm." I stepped closer. "You took money from a criminal organization. You knew exactly what you were doing. Don't lecture me," he snapped. "You've been waiting your whole life to prove you're better than me, haven't you? Hiding behind your badge, pretending you're not one of us." Crawford's tone hardened. "Mr. Hayes." Richard rounded on him. "And who the hell are you?" "My daughter brings her boss to a family barbecue to humiliate her father." "Is that it?" The agents exchanged looks, tensing. I felt my composure slipping, but forced my voice steady. "Dad, stop. This isn't about me. You compromised an active federal investigation. A mother and her children nearly died because of your greed." He stared at me like he didn't recognize who I was. "I did what any father would do. Helped his family." "You call that greed?" I wanted to scream. Instead, I said quietly, "You call that love." Something in his expression cracked, but before he could answer, Crawford gave the signal. The two agents stepped forward, reading his rights as they moved. Richard stumbled back, realizing too late what was happening. "No." "Don't touch me. This is a mistake." "Sir." "Please cooperate," one agent said, taking his arm. Margaret cried out, rushing forward, "Richard, please just listen to them." He jerked away, but the agents were trained for this. Within seconds, his wrists were cuffed behind his back, the metallic click of the handcuffs slicing through the stunned silence. "Lauren," he said, voice hoarse, almost pleading now. "You can't let them do this. You're my daughter. I met his eyes. And you're a man who sold a safe house to the mob." Chloe suddenly pushed past Daniel, shouting, "Stop!" He didn't mean to. He was trying to help. "You're ruining everything. Our family, my wedding, all of it." I turned to her, my voice low but firm. "He already ruined it. I'm just here to clean up the mess." She glared at me, eyes glassy with tears. "You sound just like him." Maybe she was right. Crawford nodded to the agents who led my father toward the waiting car. The party guests parted silently as he passed their faces, a mix of shock and pity. The string lights swayed overhead in the evening breeze, still flickering as if mocking the word celebration. Margaret sank onto the porch steps, her hands shaking. Chloe knelt beside her, sobbing. Daniel stood uselessly to the side, staring at the ground. I looked down at my mother. "You knew, didn't you?" I asked quietly. Her eyes met mine for a fleeting second before she looked away. "I wanted to believe it was just a sale," she whispered. "He said it would fix everything." The sound of the car door slamming cut through the air. The convoy started down the gravel drive, headlights slicing across the darkening yard. I stayed there a moment longer, surrounded by the smell of burnt food and silence. The music had stopped, but the faint hum of the generator kept going. A reminder that life in all its ugliness never pauses. As the red and blue lights faded into the distance, I finally exhaled. The family reunion was over. And so was the family. The next morning, the office felt different. Heavier, quieter, as if even the air carried shame. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew. The arrest in Charlottesville had made the local news, and by dawn, half the agency had already seen the headline, "Federal Agent's Father Charged in Safe House Scandal." I walked into the briefing room, ignoring the looks that followed me. Patricia and Crawford were waiting inside, along with 2 agents from the FBI task force. The blinds were drawn, the fluorescent lights humming above the table stacked with evidence folders. Patricia stood holding a document. "We found new correspondence between Richard Hayes and Grace Palmer," she said quietly. "Emails dated 3 weeks before the sale closed." She slid the papers toward me. My father's words stared back at me in neat, clipped sentences. "Keep this quiet. Don't let my daughter know until it's done. I'll add $50,000 to your commission if you can close before June. I want this settled before she comes home." I felt the air leave my lungs. He hadn't just gone behind my back. He'd planned to. He'd bribed her to keep me in the dark. Patricia's voice cut through the static in my head. "That's intent, Lauren. Clear as day. I could barely look up." Did he even hesitate? She hesitated before answering. "Doesn't look like it." Ryan McCall entered, then holding a tablet. "Grace Palmer gave a full statement last night," he said. "She confirmed she knew the buyers were connected to the Costello network. Said your father insisted on a cash-only deal. He didn't care who they were as long as the money cleared." I stared at him, unable to hide the disbelief in my voice. He knew they were mob-connected. Ryan's tone was matter-of-fact. He knew enough. Palmer said he used the phrase, "as long as it's clean on paper." That's a deliberate blind eye. Crawford crossed his arms. So he wasn't tricked, he was complicit. Ryan nodded. Full stop. The room went silent again. The only sound was the buzz of the air vent and the faint squeak of Patricia's pen as she jotted notes. After a moment, Crawford said, "Hayes, you're being placed on administrative leave. Effective immediately." I looked up sharply. "What you know the policy?" "Conflict of interest. You can't stay attached to a case involving a family member. I started to protest, but his expression stopped me. He wasn't angry, just tired. "This isn't punishment," he said. "It's protocol." Ryan looked at me sympathetically. "It's for your protection, too. Every defense attorney in the country would jump on your involvement." I swallowed the lump in my throat. "Understood." Patricia gave me a long, apologetic look. "You'll still be updated on the administrative side. I'll handle the field coordination." I nodded, unable to speak. Crawford ended the meeting, and the others filed out, leaving me alone with the folder. I sat there for a long time, staring at my father's words, until they blurred into nothing. By the time I got home that evening, the adrenaline had drained away, replaced by a hollow ache that reached somewhere deep in my chest. I dropped my keys on the counter and sat down at the kitchen table. In the corner of the room, an old box of files caught my eye, the remnants of my father's real estate business I'd kept after he went bankrupt. I pulled it onto the table and flipped through the folders. Old contracts, faded property photos, tax records. One document stopped me cold. A training manual he'd once written for new agents in his firm titled Ethics in Real Estate Transactions. His handwriting covered the margins, notes about integrity, caution, diligence. I opened the first page and his voice came back to me from years ago. "Never sign anything you haven't read in full," he'd told me. "Your signature is your word. If you give it away lightly, it'll come back to own you." That was the man I'd admired, the one who taught me to be meticulous, fair, honest, the one who preached about reputation and self-respect as if they were sacred. Now that same man had lied, forged, and sold a government asset to criminals for cash. My eyes stung. I didn't cry for him being in custody. I cried for the hypocrisy, for the memory of who I thought he was. I pressed the heel of my hand against my eyes until the ache subsided. When I finally looked up, the house was dark, the only light coming from the papers spread across the table. The phone rang, startling me. It was Patricia. "Lauren." "I wouldn't call if it weren't important," she said softly. I straightened in my chair. "What's happened?" "Your father's lawyer just filed a request for a cooperation deal. He wants to bargain with the feds." My stomach twisted. "Bargain how?" "He's offering information." Patricia said, "Names, account numbers, whoever the middlemen were between him and Costello's network." I was silent for a long moment. "So he's not coming clean. He's just trying to save himself." Patricia hesitated, then said, "It looks that way. The Bureau's reviewing it now." I closed my eyes. "He's doing it again," I whispered. "Trading someone else to buy his way out." "Lauren." Patricia's voice was gentle. "You can't fix this." "I'm not trying to fix it," I said. "I just need to understand how the man who taught me right from wrong forgot every word of it." She didn't answer. The line clicked softly, and I sat there listening to the empty tone. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet, the air thick with summer heat. I stared at the pile of papers on the table. The ethics guide, the faded contracts, the headlines flashing on my phone about the Hayes case. In the stillness, I could almost hear his voice again. "Never sign anything you haven't read." He'd signed everything this time, and he hadn't read a damn thing. I leaned back in the chair, exhaustion pressing down like gravity. For the first time in my life, I wasn't sure whether I'd inherited my father's strength or his blindness. The courthouse steps were swarming with cameras by the time I arrived. Reporters lined the barricades like vultures waiting for something to die. Microphones, outstretched voices clashing over each other. I kept my head down, flashing my badge only to get through security even though it didn't mean much anymore. Today I wasn't there as a deputy marshal. I was there as a witness. Nothing more, nothing less. Inside the federal courtroom buzzed with low murmurs. The air smelled like old paper and nerves. I took my seat near the back, hands clasped in my lap, while my father sat at the defense table flanked by his attorney. He looked smaller than I remembered, his once slick hair now gray at the edges, the confident tilt of his shoulders, replaced by a stiffness that didn't belong to him. Crawford had warned me not to attend, said it wouldn't help anyone, least of all me. But I couldn't stay away. I needed to see it, to see him confronted with what he'd done. The clerk called the session to order. The prosecutor, a woman named Claire Stevenson, stood tall and composed her stack of files perfectly aligned. "Your Honor," she began, "the evidence will show that the defendant Richard Hayes knowingly and willfully sold federally designated property used by the United States Marshals Service for witness protection purposes. Furthermore, the defendant engaged in deliberate concealment of this fact from both the agency and his own daughter, Deputy Marshal Lauren Hayes." A wave of whispers rippled through the spectators. I felt the words hit me like static. The defense attorney, an older man with too much confidence and not enough conscience, rose. "My client, Mr. Hayes, maintains that he was unaware of the property's status," he said smoothly. "He believed he was acting within his legal rights. This was at worst an administrative misunderstanding." Administrative misunderstanding. I clenched my jaw. Selling a safe house to the mafia for cash. Apparently that was just bad paperwork now. The prosecutor began presenting evidence. Transaction records flashed on the screen. The $1.1 million wire from Bayfront Holdings. The $200,000 consulting fee. To Grace Palmer. The emails. Each one landed like a hammer. Then she read aloud the email I'd already memorized. "Don't tell my daughter until it's done. Keep this quiet." My stomach turned. Grace Palmer was called next. She wore a beige suit and too much makeup. Her expression the practiced neutrality of someone coached by a lawyer. When the prosecutor asked how she knew my father, Grace smiled faintly. We'd worked together before, she said. He reached out about selling the Arlington property. He was very clear about wanting it done quickly. Did he ever express concern about the buyer? Grace hesitated, eyes darting toward the defense table. He said he didn't want any delays. He asked for cash. He told me not to mention it to anyone, especially his daughter. My chest tightened. The defense attorney stood his tone sharp. "Ms. Palmer, isn't it true that you never told Mr. Hayes the property was under federal jurisdiction?" She shrugged. "He didn't ask." That single sentence hung in the air, damning in its simplicity. When it was over, the prosecutor called me to the stand. My hands were steady as I took the oath, but inside I felt like I was walking a tightrope over fire. Deputy Hayes Stevenson said gently, "You were the one who purchased the property." "Correct." "Yes, and you designated it for agency use." "Yes." "Did you ever authorize your father to sell it?" "No." My voice didn't waver. "I revoked his power of attorney years ago. He knew that." The defense attorney rose again. "Deputy Hayes, would you say your relationship with your father was strained?" I met his gaze. "You could say that. So you have reason to resent him." "I have reason to tell the truth." He smirked. "And you stand to benefit professionally from appearing cooperative with your agency after this scandal, do you not?" The words landed like a slap, but I refused to look away. The only people who benefited from this were the ones who bought the house, and they don't work for the government. The courtroom was silent for a heartbeat. Then the judge nodded for him to move on. By late afternoon, both sides had said all they could. The judge retired to deliberate. I sat there numb, listening to the shuffle of papers, the muted coughs, the faint buzz of fluorescent lights. Margaret sat a few rows behind me, pale and trembling. Chloe had her arm around her, trying to hold her together. When the judge returned, the air went still. He adjusted his glasses and began to read the verdict. Richard Hayes. You are found guilty on 2 counts, the unauthorized sale of government property and obstruction of justice. Considering the scope of the violation and the cooperation provided during the investigation, this court sentences you to 6 years in federal custody. The sound hit like thunder. Margaret gasped, her hands covering her mouth. Chloe whispered something to her that I couldn't hear. The judge continued, his tone measured but stern. Margaret Hayes, as co-signer and beneficiary of the proceeds, This court sentences you to 2 years supervised probation. The gavel struck. And then it happened. My father stood abruptly, his chair scraping across the floor. His face was red eyes wild. "This is bullshit," he shouted. "You think this is justice? You think I'm the villain here?" He turned, pointing at me, his voice breaking. You did this to me. You sold me out to look good for your bosses." The marshals moved quickly, closing in on him, but he kept shouting, "You're just like them. Cold, selfish. You ruined your own father to climb another rung on your damn ladder, Mr. Hayes," the judge warned. But he didn't stop. "You think you're better than me, Lauren. You're not. You never were." They restrained him then, pulling him back as he kept yelling his words, unraveling into incoherent rage. Margaret collapsed into her seat, sobbing, while Chloe screamed for them to stop. I didn't move, I didn't speak. I just sat there watching the man I'd once idolized thrash against his own consequences. When they finally dragged him out, the courtroom was silent, except for Margaret's muffled crying. I stood smoothing the front of my blazer and walked out the side door before anyone could stop me. The corridor outside was cold, bright, endless. By the time I reached the courthouse steps, the reporters were waiting again. Cameras flashed, voices called my name, questions sliced through the air. "Agent Hayes, any comment? Did you testify against your own father? Are you proud of the verdict?" I didn't answer. I walked straight through the chaos, eyes fixed on the horizon, my face a mask I could barely hold together. I wasn't proud. I wasn't relieved. I wasn't anything. As I reached the car, I caught my reflection in the window. Tired eyes, jaw clenched. A stranger looking back at me. In the stillness of that moment, I realized there were no winners here, no justice clean enough to wash away the blood on both our hands. I'd upheld the law, but I'd lost everything that made it worth defending. I didn't win. I didn't lose. I just survived a war that should never have been fought. 3 weeks after the verdict, the noise had finally died down. The headlines faded, the cameras moved on to someone else's disgrace, and I was left with silence. Thick, heavy silence. The agency insisted I take leave for my own well-being. I didn't argue. There wasn't anything left to fight about. I drove back to Richmond in the early morning, the highway cutting through miles of farmland and mist. When I pulled into my mother's driveway, the house looked smaller than I remembered. The flower beds were overgrown, the shutters needed paint, and the porch light was still burned out. Inside, everything was neat, but empty, as if someone had cleaned too much in an effort to erase what couldn't be erased. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and loneliness. My mother sat in the living room, a thin blanket wrapped around her shoulders. A half-empty cup of tea rested on the table beside her, gone cold. She didn't look surprised to see me, just tired. "You came," she said softly. "I wasn't sure I should," I answered. She nodded toward the armchair opposite her. "Sit down. There's something you should see." On the table lay a folded piece of paper creased from being opened too many times. She picked it up carefully, hands trembling, and held it out to me. It came yesterday. From the prison. The letterhead read, "Federal Correctional Institution, Coleman, Florida." My father's handwriting. Strong, familiar, too confident for a man in a cell. Filled the page. "Margaret," it began. "I've had time to think. I see now that I went too far. I only wanted to restore our name, to give our family back the respect we lost. Tell Lauren I'm sorry. Tell her I never meant to hurt anyone. Tell her I only wanted to make things right." The signature at the bottom, Richard, looked rushed, smeared slightly with what might have been ink or maybe tears. I read it twice before setting it down. My mother watched me carefully, her eyes red-rimmed. "He says he's sorry," she whispered. I stared at the letter for a long moment. "He's not sorry for what he did," I said quietly. "He's sorry he got caught." She winced, clutching the edge of the blanket. "Lauren, I mean it. That letter isn't an apology. It's a justification." Her voice trembled. "He was wrong, but he's still your father." I looked up, meeting her eyes. "And you're still his wife. You knew what he was doing and said nothing." Tears welled up, but she didn't look away. "I was afraid," she admitted. "I thought if I ignored it, it would stop. I didn't want to lose him again." I nodded slowly. Silence is its own kind of choice. She covered her face with her hands and began to cry softly. The sound was thin, fragile, like something breaking far away. I wanted to feel pity or forgiveness, but all I felt was exhaustion. When she finally looked up, her voice was barely a whisper. "I was wrong. I know." I walked to the small cabinet near the fireplace and picked up an old photo frame. It was the four of us. Dad, Mom, Chloe, and me, around a Thanksgiving table years ago. My father's arm was around my shoulders. His smile, the same confident one he wore the day they arrested him. I ran my thumb over the glass, then set the photo gently back on the mantel. "This used to mean something," I said quietly. "Now it's just history." She didn't respond. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees. I checked my watch. I should go. My mother looked up, startled. "You just got here. There's nothing left to say." At the door, I paused. "Mom." She looked up, eyes swollen. "Don't write back to him yet. Let him sit with what he's done. Let the silence do what words can't." She nodded faintly, and I left. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard as I walked to my car. When I opened the door, something on the passenger seat caught my eye. A small, unmarked envelope. It must have come through the agency mail forward. Inside was a single handwritten note on plain stationery. "Deputy Hayes, I wanted to thank you. Because of you, my children and I are alive. We're safe. We'll never forget what you did for us. With gratitude, Elena Moretti." A photo was tucked behind it. Elena, with her 2 kids, smiling in front of a small house somewhere far away. The boy was missing a front tooth. The girl held a puppy in her arms. I stared at it for a long time, then leaned back in the seat. The sun was low now, its light spilling gold through the windshield, warm against my face. I thought about all the nights I'd lain awake, replaying every decision, every word, wondering if anything I'd done had mattered. And now, in one quiet picture, I had my answer. I folded the letter carefully and held it in my lap. My eyes burned, and before I could stop it, the tears came, slow, steady cleansing. Not for my father, not for the family that had fallen apart, but for the 3 people still breathing somewhere because I'd done my job right. For once, that was enough. The street outside was empty, the last light of day stretching across the asphalt. I sat there until the sky turned pale pink and the shadows swallowed the house behind me. When I finally started the car, I didn't look back. 2 years later, the world had moved on, but my name still carried an echo of the past. The morning news played softly in the break room while I poured my coffee. The anchor's voice was polished, impersonal, the kind that could make even tragedy sound routine. Former Richmond businessman Richard Hayes has been released early from federal prison after serving 4 years of a 6-year sentence. Sources say he plans to relocate to Florida and live with extended family. I didn't look at the screen. I didn't have to. His picture flashed across it every few months anyway. Gray hair, thinner face, eyes that still carried that old defiance. I turned off the TV. Outside the window, the city of Washington, D.C. was waking up. Sunlight catching on the marble of nearby buildings, traffic rolling through the streets, the hum of government life resuming as if nothing had ever cracked beneath it. At headquarters, things were different now. The halls felt newer, more polished. The people, too. Fresh recruits who whispered when I passed, respectful but careful. They knew my name, my record, and my story. "Morning, Chief," one of the deputies greeted as I entered the main operations room. "Morning," I said, nodding as I scanned the monitors. I was a supervisory deputy now, head of a small regional task force overseeing witness relocation operations across 3 states. A title that sounded powerful but mostly meant more responsibility and less sleep. On my desk sat a neat stack of reports from the night shift. Routine transfers, one near escape in Baltimore, an internal review from the Arlington sector. My phone buzzed with 3 unread messages from the district office. Business as usual. Still, I felt the eyes that followed me when I walked the floor. A mixture of respect, pity, and quiet awe, as if I'd survived something they couldn't imagine. Crawford was waiting in my office when I got there, leaning against the window, coffee in hand. The lines around his eyes had deepened, but his presence hadn't changed. Steady, immovable. "You're early," I said. "Old habits." He smiled faintly. "Heard the news." I nodded, setting my bag down. "Yeah, thought you might." He studied me for a moment. "How do you feel about it?" I shrugged. "It doesn't matter where he is. Florida's far enough." Crawford took a sip of coffee, watching me carefully. "You know, when this started, I thought it would break you. Hell, it would have broken most people." "It did," I said quietly. "I just didn't stay broken." He smiled at that. Small, proud, sad. "You made the harder choice, Hayes. You chose the law over blood. Not many can live with that." "I don't feel proud," I said. "Just not sorry." He nodded. "That's enough." We talked a bit about upcoming cases, the new relocation protocols, the young agents he wanted me to mentor. Then he left and I was alone again. The hum of the office, a distant drone beyond my door. I sat down at my desk and looked at the photo that had replaced all the others. A group picture of my team taken a few months earlier after a successful operation. No family portraits, no personal mementos. Just the people who trusted me with their lives, and the law that bound us all. My mother still lived in Richmond. We spoke occasionally, our conversations polite but shallow. She spent her days tending a small garden behind the house, growing roses because she said they hurt and bloom at the same time. Chloe had moved to California trying to reinvent herself as a digital entrepreneur. She posted videos about starting over and finding light after chaos, but every so often the press dredged up our family name. The headlines were never kind. As for my father, he was a ghost that occasionally wrote letters I never answered. The last one came on my birthday, a single page with the same hollow apologies wrapped in self-pity. I'd folded it neatly and filed it away under closed cases. The day passed in slow rhythm. Meetings, paperwork, logistics, calls. Around 8, the building emptied, leaving only the echo of footsteps and the hum of fluorescent lights. I stepped out onto the balcony outside my office, the city sprawling beneath me in a wash of gold and gray. From up here, everything looked smaller. Tidy, contained, orderly. It was almost easy to believe in justice from this height. The night air was cool, carrying the faint sound of sirens somewhere in the distance. I leaned against the railing, my reflection faint in the glass, the skyline stretching beyond it. 2 years, and the world had rebuilt itself. But inside, I knew the scars didn't fade. They just learned to stay quiet. People still asked me if I believed in justice after everything that happened. My answer was always the same. Justice isn't about winning or losing. It isn't about revenge or redemption. It's the line that keeps us from becoming what we hate. And some days that line is all we have. I stayed on the balcony until the city lights blurred into one endless horizon. Somewhere out there, my father was breathing free air again. Somewhere else, Elena Moretti and her kids were sleeping safely under new names. Between them lay the life I'd chosen, a life built not on forgiveness or family, but on purpose. I took a deep breath, feeling the quiet settle in around me. Tomorrow would come, and I'd be ready to face it. The autumn light in Arlington had a way of softening everything it touched. Even the iron gate rusted at the hinges seemed less harsh as it creaked open under my hand. The air smelled faintly of leaves and old dust. I hadn't been here in years, not since that night when the flashing lights turned my home into a federal crime scene. Now it was just a house again. Or what was left of one. The walls were stripped bare, the windows shuttered, the security system long dismantled. I stepped inside, and the echo of my footsteps filled the emptiness. The place felt smaller than I remembered, quieter. The faintest traces of the Moretti family still lingered. A pencil mark on the kitchen wall where Angela had measured her son's height. A chipped mug left behind in the sink handle cracked clean through. A strip of security tape clung stubbornly to the doorframe, its once bold lettering faded to gray. I walked through each room slowly, letting the silence speak. The memories came uninvited. The morning I'd first unlocked the door in 2018, boxes still in my arms full of determination and a kind of defiance. I'd told myself this house would be proof that I could build something of my own, something untouched by my father's name. This is mine, I'd whispered then, standing in the doorway. Proof that I don't need him, and now standing in the same spot years later, I realized he'd taken that from me too. Sold it, ruined it, but not broken it, because the house had done what I built it for. It protected people. It had saved lives, and maybe that was enough. I leaned against the kitchen counter, running my fingers across the cool surface where Angela used to make breakfast for her kids. My reflection in the dark window looked older, steadier. The woman who'd lived here once was gone, but what she'd fought for wasn't. For a moment I imagined my father's voice again, that familiar edge of pride and dismissal. "What are you without the Hayes name?" he'd asked me once. I answered him in a whisper to no one but the empty room. "I have honor, I have justice, I have myself." The words didn't sound bitter this time. They sounded true. I locked the front door one last time and handed the key to the federal security officer waiting outside. He nodded, no questions asked, and tucked it into an evidence pouch. The metal clicked shut, a sound that felt like closure. As I walked to my car, a light wind swept through the trees, scattering red and gold leaves across the driveway. The air was crisp, carrying that faint scent of change that only comes in late October. When I started the engine, the radio came alive mid-broadcast. A reporter's voice cut through the static. Breaking news from the Eastern District Court. Vincent Costello Jr., heir to the Costello crime family, was sentenced today to 20 years in federal prison for witness tampering and money laundering. Prosecutors credit the swift response of the U.S. Marshals Service for preventing multiple targeted attacks on federal witnesses. I turned the volume down and sat there for a moment, listening to the hum of the engine and the rustle of leaves against the windshield. Costello was done. The network dismantled. The names erased from our lists. Justice had finished what betrayal began. I drove away slowly, the house shrinking in the rearview mirror until it vanished behind a curtain of trees. The road wound through the countryside lined with maple trees shedding their last burst of color. The sunlight filtered through the branches in flashes of gold and amber, painting everything it touched with a kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't running toward or away from anything. I was just driving, forward, steady breathing in the quiet. There were still scars that would never fade, a mother who gardened alone, a sister who changed her last name, a father who'd traded everything for pride. But there were also lives that had been saved, children who still laughed somewhere because I'd made the right call. And maybe that was the balance, the scales of justice no one could see but I could feel. The radio played a song I didn't recognize, soft and distant, as the city skyline came into view far ahead. I thought again about what Crawford once told me: justice isn't about blood. It's about choice. He was right. I had chosen the law over love, truth over silence, and duty over comfort. It hadn't made me whole, but it had made me honest. The wind picked up, scattering another wave of gold leaves across the road. I rolled down the window and let the air rush in, cool and sharp, carrying the scent of autumn and something close to forgiveness. Not for him, but for myself. As the highway stretched ahead, I found myself whispering a final thought into the open air, carried off by the wind before I could take it back. Goodbye, Dad. The road curved gently, and the car moved on, disappearing into a horizon, bathed in the last light of day. If there was a lesson in everything that had happened, it wasn't about punishment or revenge. It was about understanding the price of both and deciding which one you could live with. Because when justice and family stand on opposite ends of the scale, the weight of your choice defines who you are. Laikan. So I'll ask you. If it were you when the moment came and the balance tipped, which side would you choose?